Hi, I'm Blake Lively, and I'm going to be taking the BuzzFeed quiz, which iconic Blake Lively character?
Hi besties, welcome to my channel Coravanta. With Sardar Zuriat Abbas Khan Lashariai, we can talk about the Blake Lively versus Taylor Swift drama has evolved into one of the most fascinating modern Hollywood sagas because it combines glamour, power, betrayal, shifting alliances, and the silent war of image building. And to understand it properly, one has to go back to the glittering beginnings where Blake, then fresh off her Gossip Girl fame and establishing herself as a serious actress and Ryan Reynolds' witty partner, seamlessly entered Taylor's circle of friends, which at that time functioned almost like an exclusive monarchy of pop culture, where Taylor handpicked her closest allies not just as friends, but as symbols of her influence, and Blake, with her elegance and charm, became a prized addition, appearing in holiday photos, red carpet smiles, and even being immortalized through her children's names in Taylor's lyrics, creating the illusion of an unbreakable sisterhood. Yet beneath the perfectly staged friendship, there were fractures invisible to the public but obvious to insiders. Fractures that began with Blake's sharp realization that Taylor's friendships revolved around hierarchy, control, and optics rather than pure loyalty, and Blake, fiercely independent, began to resist the subtle, unspoken rules of always orbiting Taylor's narrative. While Ryan Reynolds, never one to mince words in private, often joked at Taylor's expense, planting seeds of unease that would one day bloom into full-blown conflict. And thus begins part one of this saga, the secret rift, when Blake stopped feeling like a celebrated equal and instead like a supporting character in Taylor's empire, leading to subtle withdrawals, missed calls, dinners where Taylor wasn't invited, and gossip about Blake quietly questioning the fairness of being in a friendship where one person's career and image always overshadowed the others. And while none of this was visible to the millions of fans who still saw birthday posts and shared events, Hollywood insiders began noticing the silence between them at certain gatherings, the carefully cropped Instagram posts, and the way Taylor began leaning more heavily on Selena Gomez and other confidants as Blake drifted, all of which set the stage for part two, the betrayal and manipulation, where the friendship Cold War turned active, with Blake allegedly holding private conversations where she criticized Taylor's methods of weaponizing victimhood and control, and Taylor, a master of narrative, ensuring that her own image never faltered by quietly pulling strings in the press, securing stories that made her look like the abandoned one rather than the manipulator. And matters escalated when Travis Kelce entered Taylor's orbit, because his presence not only gave Taylor a new narrative of romance, but also a masculine shield of influence that made her circle tighter and more impenetrable, leaving Blake even more sidelined, which in turn fueled more bitterness, more whispers, and eventually moments at elite Hollywood events where the tension was no longer ignorable. And while Blake plotted how to tell her side of the story without looking petty, Taylor strengthened her base, activating her loyal army of fans and industry insiders who could flip the script instantly. Which brings us into part three, the legal threats and fallout, where rumors swirled that both sides were ready to unleash documents, private text threads, and damaging testimonies to secure their version of events, with Blake allegedly reaching out to entertainment lawyers and PR experts who had previously clashed with Taylor, while Taylor's team prepared to counter any attempt of exposure with carefully timed leaks and strategic silence, creating a battlefield where no one raised their voice publicly, but everyone knew war had been declared. And during this stage, Hollywood journalists began noting the eerie absence of joint appearances, the deletion of subtle online traces, and the sharp contrast. In interviews where Blake would dodge questions about certain friendships while Taylor would subtly emphasize loyalty and betrayal in generic but pointed comments, and the fallout spiraled to the point where people in their shared social circles were forced to pick sides, with Selena standing firmly with Taylor, and Ryan being Blake's backbone in the fight. And finally, this tension leads into part four, the final showdown, which is less about who posts what or who attends which event, but about who controls the Hollywood narrative in the long run. Because in an industry where perception is power, the one who writes the final version of the story becomes the winner, and Taylor, armed with her songwriting, her fan base, and her mastery of victim-turned-victor arcs, seems untouchable, while Blake, unwilling to disappear into the shadows, prepares to use her intelligence, her Hollywood connections, and even Ryan's cutting humor to flip the game. And so what began as a picture-perfect Friendship immortalized in Instagram posts has transformed into a silent but fierce war where loyalty, betrayal, jealousy, PR manipulation, and legal threats intertwine. And while fans continue to debate whether Blake was the betrayed friend or the jealous rival, the truth is far murkier. This is not just a feud between two women, but a clash of empires, of narratives, and of images carefully built and fiercely protected. And in this battle, every look, every silence, every absence, and every whisper counts as a weapon, making the Blake Lively versus Taylor Swift drama one of the most captivating unfolding scandals in Hollywood's recent memory. One that doesn't just ask who is right or wrong, but who has the power to control how the story will be remembered decades from now. The silent war between Blake Lively and Taylor Swift didn't end with the final showdown. It only shifted into a darker, more strategic phase where the battle stopped being about friendship and loyalty and transformed into a war of legacies, image, and survival. And this is where the story truly intensifies, because when reputations become currency in Hollywood, the fight is no longer about who said what at a dinner table or who unfollowed whom on Instagram, but about who will be remembered as the victor in the long arc of celebrity history. And in this part of the drama, call it Part 5, the legacy war, the tone becomes more ruthless because Blake, once content with letting silence do her talking, realized that silence in Hollywood is often interpreted as defeat, and so she began working behind the scenes to gather not just allies but evidence, pieces of Taylor's empire that could one day be exposed in a carefully timed strike, while Taylor, always 3 steps ahead, understood that Blake was sharpening her weapons and thus reinforced her own defenses by expanding her reach not just through music, but through philanthropy, branding herself as a cultural leader too big to be brought down, which meant that Blake could no longer fight the war through traditional PR channels, but had to find cracks in Taylor's impenetrable armor. And those cracks came in the form of people, former insiders, minor industry players, assistants, and ex-friends, who had once been silenced by the glow of Taylor's fame, but who now, with Blake's subtle encouragement, began sharing their quiet discontent, feeding into a counter-narrative that Taylor's kindness was calculated, her loyalty conditional, and her empire built on control rather than compassion. And while these murmurs didn't immediately dominate headlines, they began to spread in private Hollywood circles like a virus, creating an undercurrent of suspicion that Taylor's carefully polished brand wasn't as flawless as it appeared. And this undercurrent was Blake's weapon, her way of weakening Taylor without firing a single visible shot. Yet Taylor, sensing the whispers, struck back in her own way by tightening her relationship with Travis Kelce, making it not just a love story but a power statement. Because by attaching herself to the sports world, she expanded her dominion beyond Hollywood and music into an entirely different arena of influence, one where Blake had no foothold. And so the war became asymmetric, a chess match where both players moved pieces invisibly while the audience only saw the polished smiles, the staged interviews, and the carefully curated silence. But behind those smiles was venom, because Blake wasn't just trying to survive. She was trying to ensure that history remembered her not as the jealous friend who turned on Taylor, but as the truth-teller who dared to confront the most untouchable star of the decade. And Taylor, for her part, wasn't merely protecting her reputation, she was fighting for her legacy, to ensure that when people looked back on this era they would see her as the hero, the wronged friend, the artist who rose above betrayal, which meant that every magazine spread, every talk show appearance, every award speech had layers of subtext. And the subtext was war. War fought in whispers, in contracts, in carefully drafted legal letters, and in the silent pressure applied to anyone who dared to pick a side. And as this phase escalated, what shocked insiders most was not the bitterness itself, but the sheer endurance of it, because most Hollywood feuds burn bright and then vanish. But this one only grew, feeding off time, feeding off silence, feeding off the very absence of resolution, until it became bigger than either woman individually, becoming instead a mirror held up to the industry itself, showing how power is built, how images are curated, how legacies are fought for. And in this way the Blake Lively versus Taylor Swift saga entered a new stage. One, no longer about private wounds but about public memory, about whose story will dominate the books, the documentaries, the inevitable retrospectives. And though no one yet knows who will win this invisible battle, one truth is clear. Neither Blake nor Taylor will ever let the other go quietly, because this isn't just personal anymore, it's history, and both of them know that in Hollywood, history is written not by the one who lived it, but by the one who controlled the narrative loudest and longest, and that, more than anything, ensures that this war is far from over and may indeed echo for decades, long after the stage smiles fade and the cameras stop flashing, because what they are truly fighting for is not friendship, not revenge, but immortality. The endgame of the Blake Lively versus Taylor Swift drama did not unfold like some sudden explosion, but rather like the slow collapse of an empire, where every brick had been loosened in secret, and then one day the whole structure gave way. And in this final chapter of their saga, what became obvious was that both women were no longer just fighting each other, but fighting the entire idea of who controlled the story of their lives. Because in Hollywood, the battle for legacy is the battle for immortality, and neither Blake nor Taylor was willing to leave the last word to the other. And so part 6, the true endgame, was written not on social media timelines or red carpets, but in whispers, contracts, betrayals, reconciliations, staged encounters, and carefully orchestrated silences. For Blake, this meant doubling down on her role as the quiet but calculating truth-teller, not speaking out in direct accusations, but aligning herself with journalists, industry insiders, and even disillusioned members of Taylor's broader circle who felt overlooked or discarded, planting seeds that might not sprout for months but would, when they did, grow into narratives that questioned the perfect image of Taylor as America's sweetheart. And Taylor, recognizing that these seeds were being planted, turned her attention not just to countering Blake, but to creating a shield so massive that any attacks would seem petty against its scale, releasing record-breaking albums, spearheading philanthropic projects, and positioning herself as a cultural icon whose influence transcended the gossip of Hollywood, which meant that Blake's subtle maneuvers could at times look like shadows trying to swallow a star. But shadows, as the insiders whispered, have a way of stretching, and in time those shadows began to touch Taylor's empire in ways she could not control. And so the endgame became a paradox. Taylor winning publicly, Blake winning quietly, the war fought not in headlines but in perception, and yet as the months dragged on and the saga became Hollywood's most whispered-about feud, the question insiders asked was whether either woman could truly win, because to stay in the war meant sacrificing peace, and to end it meant conceding ground, and neither was willing to do that. So the cycle became self-sustaining, Blake finding new ways to frame herself as the wounded but dignified friend betrayed, Taylor repositioning every public move as evidence of her strength and resilience, until their feud no longer needed direct actions. It lived on its own, fed by fans, tabloids, podcasts, YouTube analysts dissecting every glance and every lyric, growing into something mythic. And in the end, this was the most devastating truth of all, that the drama had outgrown its participants, becoming a story that belonged not to Blake or Taylor, but to Hollywood itself, a cautionary tale, a legend, an open-ended narrative of friendship, betrayal, and legacy that would echo for years, maybe decades. And so while there may never be a single scene of reconciliation or an explosive confrontation that resolves everything, the endgame is in the echo, the knowledge that Blake and Taylor will forever be linked, that no biography of one can ever be written without mention of the other, that their names have been braided together in the cultural memory in a way neither can undo. And that is both the tragedy and the victory of their war. Because in trying to destroy each other, they ensured they would both be remembered, immortalized not as friends, not as enemies, but as the central figures in one of Hollywood's most enduring sagas. A story without an ending, because its ending is the fact that it never truly ends. Thanks for watching. Subscribe my channel for more updates.